And today's session at 2agility.atwork meetup group is on agility. Can it survive in a project-based organization? And to speak about it and talk about his views, we have Kawaldeep Chadha from the Washington, D.C. area. And Kawaljeet has been a Scrum Master and a coach and works with Agilicious for quite a many number of years. And he's a variety of practitioner, including with Scrum and IC Agile, and he's also a less practitioner. And I'm personally in favor of large-scale Scrum as a technique to help organizations do become agile. So I'm happy to have Kawaljeet here today, so thank you. And since we're going to be short of time, we're going to turn him over it to him, so to have his thoughts. And Kawaljeet, I hope that you would be able to take questions as we go. We can take questions on the chat channel, and we can pause at various appropriate times to discuss those questions as we move forward. So thank you for being here, and over to Kawal.
Thank you, Shrikant, and thanks to you and Nina for inviting me to speak at your meetup. Honored to do that. And yeah, we can definitely, field any questions that come up during the presentation, or we can have a little bit of a time at the end to answer some of those questions. But stop me if there is some question that is relevant to a particular slide and would like to get an answer at that time. Okay. Once again, my name is Kawaldeep Chadha. I also go by Kawal. I'm an enterprise agile coach, and the reason I picked this topic was because of some of my personal experiences that I've had over the last few years. And, primarily, a lot of the organizations which were traditionally using the waterfall methodology and, using project as, as their ways of managing their work are slowly transitioning over to using, different agile frameworks and, and are trying to be agile, but they have neglected to, change from a project mindset or a project-based approach to something which is better and, is better aligned with, with agile frameworks. So that's what drove me to this topic. To give you a little background on who I am, I come from the technical background. I have worked in various different capacities with, technology teams. And I got introduced to Agile, Scrum back in 2007. And when I first started doing this, I did not believe that this would work. It took me, a couple of years to really understand what agility is all about, and not necessarily just the framework, but the mindset and the values that go behind it. So, but once I understood that, I just embraced it and more or less switched my career and took this path. So anyway, I have several certifications which may mean or may mean nothing, but I've worked with many organizations, both private and public, and both at the team level and at the enterprise level. So having said that, so why, what do we think about project-based approach when you're transitioning to being an agile organization? I think it does not work, right? So right off the bat, I'm going to say that this approach will not work. And again, this is my personal experience, and you will probably see a lot of blogs and videos on the internet now where people have started to talk about switching from a project-based software delivery to a product-based delivery. So, if that's the purpose of today's meetup, I think we are done. It's not going to work. But so let's take a look at why do we think that this will not work, right? What are some of the most common patterns that we see that do not quite well align with agile frameworks or just an agile mindset? One of it is project-based approach is kind of temporary in nature because the projects seem to have a start and an end date. And often these are created on an ad hoc basis. So a little bit, so not as much aligned with some of the strategic plans and priorities that the organizations may have at the program level. And because these projects have a start and an end date, the teams normally disband after the project is over, right? And even if you take a step back, before these teams are formed, right? Before the disband, and when the teams are formed, these teams are created by pulling people who may have been working on some other projects as well, right? A lot of times there are situations where there's some burning need or a burning desire to do something on an urgent basis. So people get pulled from different projects and a team is formed, right? So which is why they are kind of ad hoc. And I don't know if I've worked in organizations where, there was a concept of tiger teams, right? Like there's some burning problem and all of a sudden you're going to pull experts out of other teams to work on this issue. So because of that, there's a little bit of lack of focus because these people have other commitments as well, right? So they seem to be working on multiple projects. So which makes it a little bit hard. The other thing is these team members are recognized more for their output and how many deliverables they create rather than the value that has actually been created. So these are some of the anti-patterns that we see in a project-based organization. So there's like I mentioned earlier, there's a lack of alignment to any program or organization priorities that may exist. And the mindset, like I said before, the mindset is still the same, right? Mindset hasn't changed, which is more of a command and control mindset. And this is a very common anti-agile pattern that we see. So let's take a look at some of the impacts of continuing to use a project mindset and what kind of effect it has on the team's agility and also the organization's agility. Now, since the teams have not been together for long, it takes a fair bit of time for the team members to build some kind of trust and respect for each other. And in my experience, what I've seen is it sometimes could take multiple iterations of sprints before that kind of camaraderie or respect or trust is created between the team members. And because of that, team members tend to work in silos. There's a little lack of collaboration. There's also a constant fear of failure because there's a desire to look good. And the other thing that also plays a role in this is they are under constant pressure to deliver something, right? On a project, all the scope is more or less defined upfront. And then you're given a hard deadline and you're required to deliver this, within the budget and the time that you've been allocated. So there's a constant fear of failure. And the result of that is team members also, are scared to experiment, right? And most of the time, experimentation is necessary to really produce good products. Your creativity also gets suppressed. Another common pattern I've seen in situations like this is team members don't feel empowered. And they in fact wait for their manager or their team lead to tell them what to do, as opposed to feeling empowered and being able to decide on how and how they're going to do their work. So, there's a lack of empowerment and focus. Focus is more on metrics rather than the value that you're going to be creating by building this product. One of the other things that I've commonly seen is quality is the first thing that goes out of the window, because that's something that people feel that they can easily, cut corners on, in a rush to deliver something within a certain time frame, and because they have to meet a certain goal or a deadline. So I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but I often notice that teams may think that they have actually produced whatever they need to do within a certain time frame, but quality suffers.
So would we want to pause here to take some questions? We presented a lot to the audience.
Sure.
So maybe I thought I'll kick it off, right? Let me challenge your thinking. I believe that agility has nothing to do with project management. The dichotomous thinking that you require product to be agile, in my books, doesn't exist. You can be agile with or without product, or with or without project. So what would you say to that, Kawal, if I challenged you that way?
So Shrikant, again, your experiences, and I'm pretty sure there are other folks who have had different experiences with this construct. But I am sharing what I've noticed in organizations which have followed this mindset or a construct. Now, you can make it work, but again, what I have seen in my experience is that in the long term, you will not be successful. Again, there are certain patterns which emerge in a project-based approach, which are, kind of anti to the agile values and principles. So you can potentially make it work, and I know a lot of organizations do this. At the same time, I found the product-based approach to be a little bit better in aligning what the organization wants to do at the strategic level and what the teams do at the tactical level. Seems to fit a little bit better, according to me.
No, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that product is not superior. I do believe in product as well. All I'm pointing out is two things primarily. One is the Agile Manifesto per se does not talk about product or project. So it just focuses on experimentation and allowing team to do work in a way that they follow experimentation and quick validation with customers than anything else. And you can do that both in a product and a project framework. The other thing that I'm pointing out is that the product problem is beyond the technology teams that we're talking about. Often in organizations, we're talking about mostly very old school organizations where projects are hugely embedded. In these organizations, the project is a symptom of how they've been managing the products. What they call as products and services often are not truly products and services, are not really defined in a customer-centric manner. So therefore, it naturally becomes a challenge in the way they are structured in order to be able to execute as a product. So without those underlying constructs changing, then it does become a challenge to have product practices in such organizations. So that's where I'm coming from primarily.
Yeah, Shrikant, I agree with you, and actually you're jumping the gun a little bit here, because I do have I was going to talk about some of the things that you're bringing up, and again, this is not going to be easy, right? Like you said, many organizations are so embedded in these constructs and methods of doing work that it's very difficult to bring about a change, right? So, and if you don't mind holding this thought for a little bit, I'm going to cover some of this in the later slides.
Sure. Thank you, Kawal.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Anyone else, if there are any questions at this time to Kawal, please feel free. There's something, there's a question from Lucy DuPont. If there's no project, what will project managers do?
So that's a topic of discussion for another time, because that alone, is probably a topic for a meetup. And again, there's an answer for that, and maybe we can take that offline.
Sure, let's hold off on it, Lucy.
Yeah.
And if we have time at the end of this session, we'll come back to that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we can just put it on the parking lot, we can address it later if we have some time. Okay. So if there's no other questions, I will move along. So again, this is my opinion and my personal experience, where I feel that a product-based software development is better suited if an organization is serious about their agile transformation, especially in the long run. We can make something like this work in the short term, but it's very difficult to make it stick and actually thrive. So again, my personal opinion on that and experience. So, and I'll talk about why I feel that a product-based approach works better in an organization that is embarking on a journey towards agility. And primarily, there's the focus is on the whole product. When you're putting the product, in the center, it helps. Not only what it does, it actually helps to clearly define what a business need is, right? What does the customer want? What does the market need? Because I can give you, there's one good example here. How many people have heard about Nokia? Right? I mean, at one time before the iPhone came along, they were the largest producers of mobile devices, mobile phones. And today they're gone, right? And there's a reason why that happened, because they did not, move fast enough to address the market needs. And that's primarily because how the organization was structured. So that was their downfall. And there are many such examples where, it could be a matter of survival if you miss the market opportunity. And then being, product focused or customer focused helps you meet some of those market, demands and get in the market on a timely manner. Now, vision and strategy that, the organizations create are longer term, right? And they generally last for the life of the product, right? As opposed to being little short-term focused, where, you start something, you end something, and then you create another project, you start something and you end something. So it creates a better alignment between, between your strategy and what the teams do, at the ground level. The other thing is, it is very prudent to keep the teams together to maintain stability and focus on what you're building. And this is another reason why having a product focus allows you to create teams which, stay together for a long period of time. And that helps to build trust and respect for each other within the teams, right? And because they're constructed in a way that they're able to complete all the work themselves, which means they're cross-functional, there are, you may not completely eliminate all the dependencies, but you reduce the dependencies to a significant level, which also helps to, achieve your goal faster. Because there's a lot of waste, and I'm not just talking agility here, but if you look at some of the lean concepts, right? There's a lot of waste introduced when you have dependencies between multiple teams. So those can be eliminated. So what are some of the benefits of the product-based approach? The customer is at the center of the universe in this case, and all the decisions that you make as an organization or as a team, you make those decisions with keeping the customer in mind. The other thing is, since the teams have been together, or the team has been together for a long period of time, the members get to know each other very well, and they have each other's back, and they tend to trust each other more, and they feel empowered to work in an autonomous fashion. So overall, increased collaboration happens in a situation like this. Now, since the team is working together, not in silos or as individuals, the focus is not on the individuals themselves, but more in terms of what value you're creating. And, and your success is measured by the success of the product, as opposed to each individual team member's performance. So they don't, the other thing is, they, like I said earlier, there's a shift in mindset here, and, they don't feel that they need a manager to tell them how to do their work, right? They feel empowered to make those decisions by themselves. The other benefits are, it's a little bit easy to implement DevOps, and automation becomes a little bit easier because again, this is my experience where I've seen that many places that I was asked to come in and do a transformation, they were not very open to doing automated testing, right? They thought that was an overhead, and it would take a long time to do it. But it's a little bit easier to justify automation if you are thinking about the entire life cycle of the product, as opposed to just thinking about a short project. So these are some of the benefits that you get by using the product-based approach. Any questions on this? Also, by introducing DevOps, you reduce the end-to-end cycle time, because one of the things I've seen is when you have different teams working on different aspects of the product delivery, it takes much longer, right? Releases could take like sometimes several days to weeks before you can actually deliver or release something and put it in the customer's hand. And by creating automation and putting in DevOps, you can reduce that end-to-end cycle time significantly. Now, nobody said, and Shrikant, as you alluded to earlier, there are a lot of challenges to making this shift, right? It's not easy, and it's it's a lot harder than we think it is. Primarily because people just don't like change. The other thing is you require, and if you are going to embark on something like that, you have to get 100% backing from the top management, right? From the executives for this to succeed. Otherwise, this will not go very well. And I've seen that happen. Sometimes, managers or the executives will say, oh, let's give it a try and see if it works. Now, if that's your attitude going in, then unlikely that you will succeed, at least in the long term. You might see some benefits in the short term, but in the long term, it will be very difficult for this to succeed. The other thing is, it does require organization change. Now, if you are a big organization, that is almost an impossible task. So that's why some of these constructs have stuck around for a long time, and they find it very difficult to break out of these, these shackles. The other thing I've seen is, the biggest resistance actually comes from the middle managers, because, they are kind of insecure in the sense that they can't figure out what their role is going to be, right? It might impact what they're doing. They feel that their role might get eliminated. or they may lose some power, right? So, you can see resistance from different places in the organizations, but in my experience, I've seen that the biggest resistance comes from the middle managers. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to show an example of an organization change that I was involved with with a client. And in fact, this is an ongoing work right now. Again, these things take a lot of time. So, I'm going to share, and this actually required a change in the organization. So let me give you a little bit of a backstory here. So this organization had, at the executive level, they used to come up with their plans and, the strategies for the next couple of years, right? But they had no alignment or visibility into what the teams were doing. The teams were more or less working on whatever they thought was important. And most of those decisions were were made not based on what the actual end user wants or a customer wants, but were made primarily on what the technical people thought would be more important to do, right? So this is where they were. And also these teams kept changing, right? There was no stability in the teams. They kept, based on how much work one team had, they would pull people from one team, they put them in the other team and so on. So there was a, lack of any kind of collaboration, coordination within the team members in the team, right? They all kept working in silos. And this was back in 2019 when I first was brought into the organization to help with their agile transformation. And I spent 2-3 months just witnessing, what they were doing. And at that point, I realized that the way they were going, they had no chance of, adapting any form of agility or, or any kind of agile framework to see any true, real benefits of using it, right? So at that point, I shared with them this approach where they need to form stable teams, right? Keep the teams together. And instead of bringing people to the work, bring the work to the people. So that way, your teams are stable. They've been working together. They already have some kind of synergy within the team, right? They understand each other, and then you bring the work to them. So the other changes that were required was actually helping them organize their work. So at the program level, what I suggested to them was to create a program backlog. Now this backlog consisted of, all the features or the capabilities that the organization wanted to introduce for that upcoming year, right? And this was, this was managed and handled by, somebody called the product manager. Now, in some organizations, you could have a different name. I've also seen program managers or product managers, but the responsibilities are the same, right? So we formed a so-called product team with all the product owners of the different products which fell under this program. So at that level, they created their strategic plans. They did the road mapping in terms of deciding, how many releases to make and, at what frequency. And then at the product level, each product had its own product backlog and its own product owner, right? So one product owner per product backlog. Again, this was.
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry, because I asked a question, but I don't know if you saw it, and it's kind of a time-sensitive question.
Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't see the chat.
Oh, why don't you read it out, Elise?
Yeah, I'll kind of reframe it a little bit. I'm finding this helpful, but for me, it's a little bit abstract. Like for me, I don't know if anyone else agrees, but when I'm learning, it really helps to say like what kind of company it was, and maybe like to bring to life a little bit some of the examples of, okay, so the devs were focusing on this particular feature. Like for me to, yeah, to bring it to life, if there's any way you could be more specific without, you know, obviously giving away anything confidential, for me, that would really help me learn and remember, you know, what you're talking about a little bit more. Right now, it could be, it's very abstract of a concept.
Sure. So Elise, thanks for the feedback and your question. So I will try and give you a little bit more context on where this is coming from without actually uh, disclosing the name of the client. But this is a federal client, and they do a lot of research work and in the medical, in the field. So, they have teams of people, and a lot of them are actually PhDs, scientists, who have become software engineers, right? So for many years, they started writing applications, they learned how to write code, and they started building these applications to help with their research. So some of the things or the patterns that they had were where they were making decisions what needed to be built, and not quite listening to what the actual customer need was, right? So they were deciding as opposed to asking the customers what they wanted, right? So there was a lack of focus on the actual product that they were building, but more in terms of what technology that they wanted to build. Now, which works to a certain extent, but unless you are building the right thing, that whatever you're building, may not be very useful to the end users, right? So that's where they were coming from, and there was a lack of alignment between what they kept doing at the team level to what what the management actually wanted to do. The other problem they had was the product owners were not empowered, and some of them were actually supporting more than one product. So these people were getting requests to do things from various different stakeholders, right? And because of that, they would never achieve what they wanted to do, that they started doing for a sprint, for example, right? So they started a sprint with a certain goal, but they rarely met those goals because they kept getting requests from all kinds of sources, like, hey, can you stop doing this and start working on this thing? So, and then at the program level, at the management level, they had no clue that these things were happening, and they were wondering why the teams are not delivering on what they agreed to. So that, just to give you a little bit of a context where, where this is coming from. So Elise, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it helps. I think you started out but then I still, like, for me, instead of saying stakeholders, for me, it would be more useful to say, okay, the VP of this or sales, can, like, just if as best you can to weave it in through everything that you're talking about. For me personally, I don't want to speak for everyone, but that to me is more, would bring it to life more than just saying stakeholders or just saying, do you understand what the feedback that I'm giving? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, no, I understand. So in this particular case, there were, they have these folks who are known as curators. So they are like the first line, of data that the organization is getting from different other researchers external to the organization. So they curate the data that comes in, right? So every day these curators are handling, tons of data, right? They're going through it, figuring out what's right, what's wrong. And if they find something that's not working, they go directly to the developers and say, hey, stop doing what you're doing. I need you to fix this right now.
Right.
So, so the reason I use the word stakeholders is because, it could be anybody, right? In different organizations, it could be different people. So in this particular situation, it was the curators mostly who were going directly to the developers and requesting changes without, fully understanding if it was needed or if it was needed right away. right? Because sometimes things can wait. You don't have to do it right away. You can wait till the sprint ends and you can maybe potentially handle it in the next sprint. So it was very disruptive for these teams to be able to, actually achieve their goals for the sprint.
Thank you for following up and checking in.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah. Any other questions? So as part of this organization change, we started implementing what's known as feature teams. So these teams were stable. The idea was that we keep those teams stable and just bring the work to them, right? So each product had one or multiple feature teams. And later on, I'll also explain the framework that I introduced for them, which is very simple to do. And actually, Shrikant referred to this or alluded to this particular framework a little earlier as well. So again, the goal here is that you have one product owner and one product backlog per product. So the framework that I recommended to them is called LESS. It stands for Large Scale Scrum. Now, there are other scaling frameworks as well. And, you have to decide which one works best for you. Again, I am a safe SPC, and I also am a certified LESS practitioner. And I prefer this approach or this framework over the others. For one, it's much easier to implement, and it can be implemented without too many changes to the existing organization. So that's what, to me, makes it very, very, very useful and efficient to implement. So I'll explain this a little bit in a little bit more detail. So the important thing here is the product itself, right? You want to make sure that you have only one product owner for a product, right? And a single product backlog, because that is paramount. If you don't start with that, then everything, kind of flows downstream from there, and, it becomes messy if you don't do this. Your product owner is a single, voice. So they decide what the priority is, and what should be delivered and when. And any other, again, I'm going to use the word stakeholders, if and there's several of them who may have their own priorities and demands, but they work with the product owner to decide, what should be the overall priority that the team will be working on. And the other question that often comes up is, what is actually a product, right? So to me, your product should be, as broad as it can be, and it should be actually viewed more from the perspective of an end user, right? What do they think the product is? For example, if you take, Microsoft, 360, right? That by itself can be a product, but within that, you have multiple things, right? You have Microsoft Word, you have Excel, you have PowerPoint, and so on. So each one of those things can be considered as products too. So when you are deciding, what your product is, you have to keep those things in mind. The other important thing you need to do when you start off is you should create what a definition of done is, and that should be common for all the teams that are building the product. And and teams are obviously welcome to expand that definition or make whatever changes they need to that fits them best. So there are only a few artifacts that are required in this type of an organization. You obviously have, like I showed in the picture earlier, you have your program backlog. And using that program backlog, the product team, creates a product roadmap. And, back in the day, these roadmaps and plans used to span multiple years, 3 to 5 years. But now that has changed, right? So most of these strategic plans, at least the organizations I'm working with now, are for a year, 12 months. The other thing is the product backlog. That's the other artifact, and a release plan. Now, every product will have its own release plan as well. And this is where the product owner comes in and decides what needs to be built and when it needs to be released. At the team level, you have your sprint backlog and your software increment that you create at the end of every sprint. Again, the sprint burn down is optional, but most teams use them now. So talking a little bit about the LESS framework itself. So if you're going to use the LESS framework, what you want to do is you want to make sure that, when you have multiple teams, you create, you have a single, sprint cadence, right? So which means that each team starts and ends the sprint at the same time. And now there are several benefits for doing that. And if you don't do that, then there are other challenges. Obviously because coordination becomes harder and your integration of work becomes harder if you don't do that. Each sprint, each team will have its own sprint backlog, and each sprint will result in an integrated product, a whole product. So if you have, for example, 3 teams working on a product, at the end of the sprint, the teams will actually demonstrate the integrated work that they have created for that product. So when it comes to sprint planning, you will have two different parts to the sprint planning. One is a sprint planning where all the teams together meet. And when I say that, it's not every team member who participates in this. It is typically attended by the product owners of the different teams and some team representatives who will participate in this, right? And this is the part where they collectively, decide what they're going to build for the next sprint, or what do they want the team to build for the next sprint. And also this is where they, will address any kind of dependencies or opportunities, to work together. And once that has been decided, then the teams will have their own sprint planning where they, at that point, discuss how they're going to build that thing. So again, do it in 2 parts. One where representatives of each team are present and they collectively decide the goals for the sprint. And then the second part where, where the teams involved, get into a little bit more detail on what they're supposed to do. They talk about the design and the tasking of, the sprint backlog items. So each team will have their own daily Scrum. And in order to, facilitate the coordination between the teams, they can decide to have a Scrum of Scrums. And the frequency of Scrum of Scrums, again, varies. It really depends on your situation. Sometimes I've seen teams do this once a week. Sometimes I've seen them do it twice a week. So it's really entirely up to you, whatever works best. Now, for product backlog refinements, there are 2 ways to do it. One is each team can have its own product backlog refinement, or they can choose to, join another team in the refinement session. Again, that depends on, how much work that they're doing is dependent on the other team. And if there's a dependency or it impacts, the work that you're doing impacts another team, then it's preferred that you do a joint backlog refinement session because it gives you an opportunity to, do coordination. And also, it's an opportunity for shared learning as well. And finally, the sprint review is common. This is the place where all the teams together demonstrate an integrated product to the users or the stakeholders. So one sprint review for all the teams. Now, retrospective, again, there are two kinds. Each teams have their own retrospectives, and they also have a joint retrospective to discuss any cross-team and system-wide issues that may have come up and they would like to address. And one important thing is here that I personally don't like to invite any managers to the retrospective, and I would suggest that having managers in the retrospective generally is not a good idea, because people don't tend to speak when that happens. So I would leave the managers out and only have the team reps and the product owners and the scrum masters in those retrospectives. Now, in the joint retrospective, you want to make sure that you're not always sending the same people every time, right? You want to keep rotating so that everybody on the team gets a chance to participate in the retrospective, the joint retrospective. So that's all I had. And I'm open to any questions at this point.
We have about 10 minutes for Kawal.
I have a question. This is Terry Harmon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Terry, go on.
One of the slides you mentioned multiple teams for one product. So it's not one team per product, but multiple teams per one product.
Yes. So yeah, you could have one team building the product, or you could potentially have multiple teams building the product.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and and that's where this less framework comes into the picture. So if you're building a large and complicated product, you'll typically have more than one team working on it. Because what you don't want to do is have one very large team, which becomes very, very difficult to manage. So in those cases, it's best to split them up. And and Scrum framework recommends that your team should not be more than nine developers at the most. So 3 to 9 is the range, and to me the sweet spot is about 5 to 6 people. Seven is the best.
Would each team have their own product owner and product manager?
No, each product will have a product owner, not each team. So if you have a product which has 5 teams, you still have one product owner.
Okay, thanks. Also, I'd like to get your contact information.
Yeah, if you can turn off your screen share, Kawal, then we can just switch to the video.
Give me 1 second here.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, are you going to be providing your contact information? Like email address?
Yeah, I can provide my contact information. I'll also share my LinkedIn profile. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
When we will send out Kawal's presentation today by email, and so we will make sure he can be reached through that. His contact information is available there.
Thank you.
So any other questions for Kawal?
Hey, it's Tammy. I have one.
Go on, Tammy.
So, and I know it's actually with regards to project managers, but we're going to cover that in another meetup, I know. But one of the things that project managers do bring to the table is helping to facilitate getting things moving, almost like a Scrum Master. One of the challenges that we're facing as we transition from very project focused to, I'll call it scaled agile, is really that empowerment, and how do you change people to accept being empowered or take the ownership. We're telling them that we want them to be empowered, but we find that the PM still has to step in to help try and like lead the horse to water. I'm curious what kind of experience, what kind of advice you'd give to that.
So that's a very good question, Tammy. What I've seen is, for one thing, in some organizations, I've seen that, when they decided to, do a agile transformation, they gave the project owners, some of them became Scrum Masters, for example, right? And that's very common. And what I've seen is there were many project managers who came from a technical background, right? And they, some of them decided to go back to that. And in some cases, there is still a need for project managers, even though, Scrum does not have that role per se. But in real life, like you said, there is still a need for project managers, because they do handle things that sometimes are is beyond the scope of the Scrum Masters. For example, they do make hiring and firing decisions, things like that, right? Budget decisions. So, so when it comes to, empowering people, sometimes it's not that easy, because people are just used to taking, directions from their leaders, right? They don't want to make those decisions, because they're scared that if they make the decisions on their own, if they fail, they will be, punished for it, right? So again, it's not an easy transition. You have to slowly build that kind of environment for the team to be able to do that, right? So that's one of the reasons why I actually don't recommend inviting a lot of the managers in a lot of these events that they have, right? Meetings that the teams may have, leave the managers out, right? Managers may not like it. So but if you're a Scrum Master or a project, request them like, hey, can you not attend this, right? And there's a reason for that, right? Because the managers there, the people are not open to discussing things. And they'll stay quiet because they will wait for the leader to say something for them. So again, it's a slow transition. You have to build that trust eventually. You have to kind of create an environment for them to succeed, and not be basically, don't punish failure, right? If you stop doing that, people will be more open to trying different things.
Thank you.
It's a soft skill. Again, I can't give you, there's no cookie cutter answer here, but these are soft skills that, everybody has to, from top to bottom, have to kind of, build slowly.
Thank you.
I can add something to that perspective that Kawal, and the question that you asked, Tammy. I don't think a project manager and Scrum Master role are even infinitely close to each other. They're completely different.
Sure.
And let me explain why. The project manager's focus is on determining and managing the plan and getting the plan executed. The Scrum Master's focus is on growing people. These are completely two different reference points. So if you take Scrum or large-scale Scrum or any Scrum-based technique or agile techniques, in that context, the role of a Scrum Master or a coach is just to focus on growing people. So the question comes is, who's managing the plan? The plan is managed by whoever manages the product. In that case, it is the product owner or a product manager. So the plan is managed by giving pieces of work to the team through the product backlog. So the team takes ownership for that. So it's a different way of doing work. So therefore, this is not really, it's not really transferable skills. Like you could relearn and do the work for sure. It's definitely something that can be done. But it's a wrong notion that you can just slide a project manager into a Scrum Master. If you flip yourself in the way you are going to support people, certainly yes. But if you're going to do the same thing that you wanted to do before, the answer is no. That if you look at Kawal's first question in this thing was, can an organization typically have agile in a project organization? And he said categorically no. I don't totally agree to that. You can still make it work, and agile is not about being a product organization. But when you talk product management, the fundamental concept of product management is having the teams aligned to customers directly. That's the missing part that we're looking at. And usually in project management, the people are aligned to the plans. In product management, the team members are aligned to market needs. And these are two different ways of actually operating.
Yeah. So, what I was referring to earlier, Srikanth, was if you look at the project manager's responsibilities, right, traditionally, and what Scrum did is, introduce two new roles, right? They introduced a product owner role and a Scrum Master role, and the traditional PM responsibilities actually got distributed between the Scrum Master and the product owner, right? So, because in this case, a lot of the product owners are actually making, product decisions, right? They're making decisions in terms of what gets released when and what should be in that release. So, in a traditional environment, the project managers would make those kind of decisions. So again, you can have a project manager role, and like Srikanth said, sometimes those responsibilities can be slightly different, right? And it could be more out, external facing, whereas the product owner, Scrum Master are more internal facing. So you could have some, arrangement like that.
Again, that would depend on the context, on the organizational context of what problem they're trying to solve. So
yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there is, there's not one answer for this. So you have to really look at the context of under which you are making these decisions.
For sure.
Kawal, can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead, Nicholas.
Hi there. I enjoyed your presentation and very curious to know a little bit more about your LESS implementation, like about how many teams there were, how many people overall for all of those batches of teams.
Yeah, so in my particular situation, I'm talking about is about 4 or 5 teams. So the framework that I just shared in my presentation will work for up to 8 teams. And yeah, okay. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, it seems like Srikanth smug in the background there. Size matters, and with up to 80 people on one sprint planning session. Wow, that's a lot of voices to be heard. And how do you get through all that in a regular 2-hour time frame? And what order even do you tackle it?
Yeah. So I don't know if you heard 80 people. I said 8 teams.
Yeah.
So up to 8 teams, this particular framework is recommended for. But if you have more than 8 teams, then, they have something called less huge, which is slightly different, just because the number of people becomes too large.
But I mean, eight teams could be 80 people though.
It is. I can add something to that. I don't
40.
think the question that Nicholas is asking is, are all 80 of them in the 8 teams in sprint planning? The answer is no, they're not there. In sprint planning, depending on context, again, if I'm doing sprint planning, the first one, then mostly it's possible that all of them might be there because they're not done one before. But from the second sprint planning, maybe 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, depending on the cadence that's being followed, only representatives of teams are there in sprint planning. So it might be just 2 members from each team, or 1 person from a team, or maybe 3 people from a team would be there. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that if Scrum is followed or done correctly the way it needs to be done, then teams are often always refining work to future sprints. So there are conversations happening during the sprints to what future work is going to be. And in those refinement process, the necessary people who are refining are going to be participating in each of those features that they're refining at that time. So therefore, there is no necessity. There's already broad-based knowledge in variety of people on the features that's being built. So only representative of certain features who know the features are required in sprint planning in the first place. So the short answer is 80 of them are not going to be there in sprint planning each time, maybe the first one being an exception.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you go through the sprint planning and you have 8 teams, do you typically just take the items from the top of the backlog, go over each one, regardless of what team they're for, or do you tackle it team by team?
Well, the idea is to not use the backlog at all. The backlog is only an ordering mechanism. So if you're really a feature-oriented team, which is market-centric, the questions that the 8 teams or 5 teams or 6 teams or whatever number of teams are there are going to ask themselves is, what is the most valuable stuff which is ordered in the backlog that we are supposed to work on in the next sprint? That's the question that comes up. Now, I would be wary of any teams actually picking it up from the backlog, which means the whole idea of agility is coming from conversations, and such conversations are not happening in sprint planning. So what really sprint planning does is have the conversations with the product owner in order to pick the high priority items that they are picking in the sprint based on understanding the why of the sprint goals in order to be able to do that. And that's the key factor that we're looking at in sprint planning, but not a backlog itself. A backlog is just a means to an end.
Yeah, thank you, Shrikant, for answering that for me. But yeah, you're right. If you look at one of my slides, I do mention that a lot of these events, which are joint team events, you don't necessarily have all the team members in there. You will just send some, representatives to represent your team. The only advice I'll have is, keep rotating those people. Don't have the same people attend those sessions every time, because it gives everybody within the team an equal opportunity to participate and, have their voices heard. So make sure that you're rotating those people.
Okay, so if half the team shows up of each team for the sprint review, then you would need to make sure that the people who worked on part of it who didn't show communicated what was developed.
So so a sprint review, is obviously, a showcase of the entire, like a integrated product, not just individual teams product, right? So in a sprint review, it's good to have the people there. And again, sprint reviews can be facilitated in many different ways, right? The most common, I know everybody has, some team member just demonstrate all the, functionality that was built within the sprint. But, you can do something like a supermarket style or a bazaar style, where you have laptops sitting all over your room, and each laptop has one functionality being demonstrated, right? So your end users or your stakeholders can walk around the room, go to that laptop and, just hands-on start playing with that thing, right? So that's another approach you can use. So for that, if you're going to do with all the team members and you're going to do it in person, then you really need a large room and a lot of organization. So that's where, the Scrum Masters and, other people have to coordinate and organize that. So that you can do it, very effectively.
Okay, and I have a question about the retrospectives. So each team has their own retrospectives where all the team members are present for that. And then they take the top 1 or 2 improvement items, maybe bring it into their own sprint backlog for the next sprint. that makes sense. But then when you have the overall retrospective, how do you capture that thing that everyone should be working on? Where does that go?
So, it's just really the same thing that you do at the team level, but at the integrated retrospective level, where all teams are represented. Those are in that session, you're primarily talking about things which affect other teams, right? So, and any action that comes out of that will be handled the same way you would handle at the team level. So if there's an action that impacts like 3 different teams, then they all will take that back and address it in their sprint.
In fact, many of these go back to the fundamental question of Agile and Scrum itself. These are techniques where we encourage people to find answers. So if I did an overall retrospective with 10 or 15 people in the room, and they're not going to act on it the next day to do something about what came out of the retrospectives and just put it in a backlog or a tracking system, it's a total waste of time. So agility is about being biased towards the right action that they need to act on and taking ownership for that. There's no point in putting it on a Kanban board and say in a to-do column or in a backlog and so forth. So when we encourage teams to work, we want to see action on those. If they come and say, these are our top 3 items that we need to change in the next sprints, you need action on that. And so if we're not leaving the retrospectives without a planned action on who's going to work on what and by when before the retrospectives is complete. Any other such retrospective where they throw things into a backlog, in my opinion, will be fundamentally quite useless.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why retrospectives are the most misunderstood and also hated most by the team members because they're not effective, right? So here's one approach I would suggest is that every time you do a retrospective, like after you've done your check-in, first look at all the actions that were taken in the previous retrospective to make sure that, and obviously during your sprint, you as a Scrum Master, as team members, right? Because you're accountable to each other, you keep making sure that, these things are being addressed. And then in the next retrospective, you start off by first looking at the actions you had taken in the previous retrospective before you do the retrospective of that sprint. So that also makes sure that, things are not falling through the cracks or are being ignored. So that's one way to, keep things, right in front.
Yeah, that's very true, right? If you're not acting on it, then new ideas are not going to come again. In the long term, the retrospectives become meaningless because if you're constantly leaving things behind, why do it at all?
Yeah, and I've seen that it happens a lot, and then that's what frustrates the team members, right? It's like, why are we even doing this? Because if you're not going to take any action, why bother, right?
And depends on the type of action as well, Nick. If you look at it, there are things that are within the team's control that the teams can act on. And there are things that are not within the control where you need action outside of the team. Sometimes you need a budget, you need some organizational change, or you need some organizational structural action. You need potentially infrastructure that you need to invest on that the teams cannot do by themselves. So you need a mechanism to act on this as well, along with the retrospectives in order to succeed.
Yeah, I find it interesting that the adding of the retrospective improvement items to the next sprint backlog has now been removed from the new Scrum guide.
Because it assumes that you are acting on it. So fundamental assumption with Scrum is that the people are allowed to do what is right. And if you're not allowed to do what is right for people on a team, then Scrum is not quite useful for you. So that's true with any technique that we use. If we don't practice the right aspects of the value that it will deliver to us, then the technique is not useful.
Yeah. And that's one beauty about Scrum, at least in my mind, is it's not very prescriptive, right? It kind of gives you the framework and some rules, but how you do your work within that framework is really up to you.
Right. They were prescribing that those improvement items go into the sprint backlog, but I guess they decided that that was being too prescriptive, and it wasn't something you could accomplish and then check off a list anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know,
Ongoing.
it's like anything else, right? I mean, to tell you honestly, I've been doing this for so many years, you know, maybe just like you and Srikanth and the others, but every day we learn something new, right? And what the way I was, you know, operating as a coach or a scrum master many years ago, you know, it's not the same way I do, you know, approach my work now, right? Because I've learned certain things along the way, and, you know, I've also changed my mind. So likewise, you know, the Scrum Align or the, you know, the Scrum Guide folks are also learning and, you know, making improvements as they go along. So it's really an agile mindset, right? Even though you founded it, doesn't mean that you're not going to learn something and change.
Did you meet with much resistance when you were suggesting they take on less?
So I did not use the word less when I shared this framework with them. You know, to tell you honestly, most places I go to, not many people know about less. You know, everybody wants to do safe. I don't know why, but just because it's kind of become like a buzzword. You know, if somebody else is doing safe, we want to do safe as well. So what the approach I take is I don't specifically give it a name. I just share, you know, that, okay, this is the easiest and, you know, best approach we can use without making too many changes. Because if you look at less, it's truly scaling Scrum, right? You're not introducing too many new roles or new roles. You know, it's really the same construct. It's just scaling to multiple teams.
From your experience, have you found that pretty much no one uses Nexus, right?
I haven't seen myself, so I don't know how you know, how prevalent that is. So
These are patterns, Nick. There's not much of a difference between Nexus and less. Technically, they are very similar. One wonders why there are two different patterns, probably just to satisfy two different types of people's egos who wanted their name on it. At best, that's the answer that I could come up with. But again, those are very fairly similar patterns. There's not much of a difference between less and Nexus.
yeah.
So
I'm
I
sorry.
think we need to wrap up. We have taken Kawal's time more than what we booked him for.
Sure.
A lot of the folks have dropped off as well. So thank you, Kawal, for being here today and triggering a very active conversation. This is a topic that you could debate forever.
Right. And again, you know, like I said, you know, people may have had different experiences with different situations. So I was coming more from my own personal, you know, experience. So my opinions are formed based on what I have been experiencing and learning. So again, there's no, you know, there's not one approach to everything. You have to look at the context. You have to look at the organization you're working with and see what fits best. So
Sure.
yeah, never go in with the fixed mindset again about just enforcing something on, you know, on the organization. So, you know, it's best to just listen and see and you know, just observe what they're doing and just address the challenges, right? And in my experience, what I've learned is when you are watching and observing what they're doing, and it kind of brings you back to what you want them to do in the first place.
But what we want somebody to do itself is a false notion, because, you know, we are trying to move from what we call as parent to child relationship which exists today in organizations to an adult relationship.
Right.
So when we treat somebody as an adult, it's based on the firm belief that they are quite capable of learning and solving the problems that they're expected to solve. And nobody needs to spoon feed them the answer in the first place.
Right.
So that's truly what this agile movement is about, right? You know, it's allowing the people doing the work to figure things out.
Yeah. Just ask a lot of questions. One thing I have really gotten better at, which I wasn't earlier, is actually asking a lot of open-ended questions.
For sure.
Yeah. And, instead of telling them what to do, just ask them questions. How would they do it if they wanted to fix a certain problem, right? So any question which does not, just have an yes or no answer, but it's kind of open-ended and, leads to more conversation.
Could I ask you one more question?
Sure.
Before we go, when you were rolling out the less thing, even without calling it less, did you get buy-in from them? Like, hey, you guys, I think we need this change. Would you like to change in this way? Did you make it a kind of a collective decision, or did you just say, hey, we're doing this, it's a directive from this PO up here?
Yeah, no. So it was not, this was just a suggestion I made to them. And I brought it up with their, program management folks and their product owners and, their leadership team. And what they saw in this was that it would address a lot of the problems they were facing. And it was not a very difficult sell.
Hello, Edson.
So,
Please, how far? When the CIO himself,
I'm sorry, looks like there's some.
Yeah, I muted him.
Okay. So anyway, I just explained to them, how this would work and how it could help solve some of the problems that they were having, and they understood that. And again, like I said, none of these changes are easy, right? I mean, it's easy to present this on slides and make it look easy, but when it comes to actual implementation, it's a lot harder because you're dealing with people, and it's with which is everybody has their own ideas and
Yeah, but then once you've gotten the agreement from the product owners, should you guys be the only ones making the call to switch, or should you also get a vote from all the devs too and Scrum Masters?
I'm sorry, with all of whom?
Should you also get a vote on whether or not to make that change from the Scrum Masters and all of the developers?
What change would that be, Nick? I'm struggling.
To move into the less framework. It's a pretty big shift in the ways of working. So
yeah,
I was just wondering how you made that shift and who all was involved in the decision.
Yeah, so a lot of this decision was initially made with the leadership team and the program, the Scrum Masters and the product owners. If you really look at it, less does not impact the teams that much, right? They're still doing what they're doing, other than the fact that now you have introduced maybe a couple of more events, and that too not everybody needs to attend, right? Like, for example, you have that first part of the sprint planning, right? Where some, reps of the team would go and, participate. Everything else is still being done the same way as they were doing before. So it's not a huge, big change for them at that level.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. If there's no other question, then.
So thank you, Kawal, for again being there. I'm going to stop the recording now.